Welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of the Institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are sitting on today, and in particular, the Darug people of the Darug Nation, where the Institute is located on Parramatta South Campus, and I pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome back to our Chinese Australian History Seminar Series. We are very pleased that many people enjoyed the series. Today, we're going to have Professor Michael Williams to talk about merchants and the Qing dynasty, 1881 to 1911. It's going to be a very interesting and informative session. I've been looking forward to it. While Michael is talking, you can post your questions at Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Michael to respond when he finishes the lecture. Now, please welcome Professor Michael Williams.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome everybody to this third in our series of lectures. And for those of you who attended previously, you might remember the previous lecture was about primarily about the gold rush period. And for many people, it's the gold rush period that's the foundation of Chinese Australian history. But in many other ways, it's this period that I'm going to talk about today, which is to say the late 19th century, early 20th century. That's really, in many ways, the foundation of Chinese Australian history. And the reason I say that is that it's this period that lays the network for many of the people who are now the descendants of these early Chinese Australians. And also it allows, it involves Chinese Australians in a far greater range of activities and occupations than simply gold mining. So in many ways, this, as I would argue, is the gold rush is the kind of psychological foundation of Chinese Australia. It's this period that I've titled The Merchants to the Qing that is in many ways the kind of real foundation. So in this period, of course, from 1881 to 1911, there are many things happening, and of course, I won't have time to deal with all of them. So I'm going to focus on four main themes as we move through an overview of this history. It's the period, for example, when white Australians particularly begin to define Australia in ways that increasingly limit the presence and participation of people from China. But it's also the period when Chinese merchants themselves build up quite strong both domestic and international trading and business networks. And this is very important to the subsequent histories. It's also a period when Chinese workers themselves are increasingly resented by European workers. It's a period when trade union movement in Australia and then later the Labor Party becomes quite strong. And this is combined with a kind of a racism and a kind of a workers' racism that sees them reject workers who are not considered to be within their field. And then finally, it's a period of where politics of reform and even of revolution become very important as during the decline of the Qing, and ultimately the period that the date that I fixed as the end of our period, 1911, sees the end of the Qing Empire and the founding or the beginning of the founding of the first Chinese Republic. And this includes an increasing sense of what we could call Chineseness. And I'll talk about a little bit more about what that means later in the lecture. So overall, I'd summarize this period as being one that is both the peak of Chinese Australian influence in this early period and also the beginning of a decline, because of course it is the beginning of the founding of the White Australia policy in 1901 with the Federation of the Australian colonies. So just to look at the beginning of the period, the 1881, we begin then with a renewal of restrictions against Chinese immigration. If you remember from the previous period, restrictions during the gold rush period had been rescinded, and for a period in the late 1860s through the 1870s, there had been no restriction on Chinese people or any other people coming to or from the Australian colonies. But this changed in 1881. And it changed for a variety of reasons to do with various labour disputes, with a renewal of increased numbers of Chinese people coming for tin mining and for a range of other business and other occupations. And so in 1881, New South Wales began to impose restrictions again. This time another £10 poll tax, the same amount as previously, but a new restriction was on naturalisation. That's to say Chinese people could no longer apply to become naturalised within the colony of New South Wales and later Victoria and other colonies as well. And this was a new restriction that was quite over and above what had been previously imposed. And these restrictions were ramped up very greatly in 1888. In 1888, the Australian colonies met and began to discuss seriously federation, and they also discussed the uniformity of anti-Chinese restrictions, and this is what they agreed to in 1888. Didn't quite achieve uniformity, but they did. But in theory, all the colonies did have some form of restriction, and New South Wales in particular, and also Victoria, ramped up their poll taxes to a much more excessive £100, and this began to have quite a significant impact on numbers of people coming into these colonies. And so we have to ask ourselves, of course, as we begin to look at these restrictions that were specifically tailored towards Chinese people, were Chinese people a cause, or were they merely a result of some other influences here? And this is something that we need to look at carefully over this period. And so before we do that, we need to look at the overall context within which this is happening. And of course, very much this is the context of colonialism, and in particular of the British Empire, of which Australia, all the Australian colonies were an integral part. And so within this empire, at this period of time, the idea was that there would be free immigration. And this was, of course, primarily for the benefit of the colonial rulers. Of course, they saw free immigration as free immigration of cheap labour. And so within that empire, Indian and Chinese people, for example, travelled down to the British Straits Settlements, what later became Malaysia and Singapore. Indians also went to Fiji and to what later became South Africa. And within Australia itself, many workers from many parts of the world came to do various kinds of work. Southeast Islanders and Japanese to work on the sugar plantations in Queensland, for example. So-called Afghans, really Indian subjects, Indian British subjects, worked as camel drivers and other work within Central Australia. And with the growing pearl shell industry in the Northern Australia, many people came from Japan, the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia to work as divers in other associated business. So for the convenience of people within Australia or in the Australian colonies, the free migration of workers was considered important because they considered that to be the free migration of cheap labour, or labour that they could get to do particular jobs, particularly harsh work that they didn't consider white workers were willing or able to do. So of course this meant within this context, if you're interested in labour politics or increasing rights, particularly wages for labouring people, you had two choices. You could go multicultural, which is to say you could say all workers are equal and everybody should be treated equally and all wages should be increased. But this was a fairly hard ask in this period. I mean, some people had that idea, but it wasn't an idea that took on very readily. So the alternative, in the Australian context at least, was to go white, which is to say that white workers are the ones to be protected and who should be equal among themselves and have their wages increased, and other workers did not merit the same consideration. So that's one context within which all this period operates. The other context is the broader one also of the so-called overseas Chinese, or Huaqiao, which isn't a term that is really used at this period, but it becomes very common later in the 20th century. But for our purposes, it's important to know that Chinese people, particularly from southern China, had been going overseas, dealing in various ways by sending out workers, by sending money back, by sending their bones back, by organising themselves along dialect and local groups. All these kinds of things that are happening in Australia had been happening in Southeast Asia and even in other parts of China since at least the Ming Dynasty, let's say at least the 16th century. And so this is a context within which Chinese people are operating, this kind of wide view of movement and travel and connections. And so much that happens in Australia isn't unique to Australia, and this is an important consideration. And just to give an example of how this is operating, this is a list of figures from one village, one modest-sized village in southern China at the end of our period in the first decade of the 20th century. And it just shows you the spread of people around the world. Some are in San Francisco, some in Hawaii, and many are scattered all around Australia. So this is a village, of course, that was focused mostly on Australia. Other villages focus on other parts of the world, Cuba, Peru, Malaysia, and so forth. So you can see quite large numbers in Sydney, but also in places such as Atherton and Cairns. And so at any one time, this village had something like 40 to 50% of its working age men overseas working out for various periods of time, sending money back, and then visiting on occasion. So this is the overall context within which many Chinese Australians were operating in this period. But within Australia, what's beginning to operate, of course, is what you could consider to be the politics of federation, as federation nears, and also the politics of whiteness. And what this means is that Australians, as say Australians, particular British or Irish heritage, are beginning to identify themselves in particular ways. And white was convenient for them because they were very divided. Many people consider themselves to be British and Christians, but on the other hand, many did not like the label British. And when they consider themselves to be Catholics, other Christians of certain types didn't consider that to be quite the right kind of Christianity. So there was these very strong divisions on both racial, cultural, and of course, religious terms. Again, Australia was beginning to consider itself a workers' paradise, which meant that the workers considered that they were better off in Australia than they had been back in England or in Ireland and these places. They wanted things to continue that way. And so they began to organise, and trade union movement is very powerful at this time, as is, of course, the growth of the Labor Party. And the Labor Party, by the end of the century, by about 1901, is beginning to consider a very straightforward platform of the White Australia policy, that there should in fact be no migration into Australia of natives of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. That's the platform which the Labor Party is willing to argue at this stage, and that migration to Australia should be white only. But the Labor Party and the working class is, of course, by no means the only ones to argue this way. And it's significant to remember this period, just how strong the trade union movement has become or is becoming, and is able to, in fact, support the first trade union-based governments in the world at this time. So very, in many ways, a revolutionary time for Australia as well. But of course, they were afraid of more things than just equal wages or cheap wages for workers. They also feared many things on what we would consider very racist cultural terms. So this is a typical bulletin cartoon of the time. And of course, we can look at this and think, well, is this a fear? This is their fear of kind of cultural mixing. But for a modern multicultural Australia, this is more like a prediction of what Australia has become, perhaps not in the same dress sense, but at least in the sense of a more casual mixing of people of different heritages without, of course, the fear that the bulletin was trying to illustrate. But I want to emphasise that not everything is happening just on a purely domestic front. So it's not just about Chinese people in Australia. Australia, then as it is today, very much was aware of China as a nation, or the Qing Empire anyway, as a large entity looming to the north. And this is illustrated, in this case, by a letter that was sent to Henry Parkes. So in 1888, there is the Intercolonial Conference, which was a move towards federation, and in which, as I said before, the anti-Chinese legislation was agreed upon among the colonies. Now, Henry Parkes was one of the leaders of this conference and one of the great advocates of Australian Federation. And he was sent a letter a couple of years later by General Edwards at Hong Kong, so part of the British Empire. He's writing to a fellow colonial part of the empire. And what he says to him, to Henry Parkes, is a portion of the Chinese Imperial Squadron is now at anchor under my windows. He's sitting in Hong Kong, in what is now the Tea Museum of Hong Kong. If you know where that is, without the skyscrapers, he could see all of Hong Kong Harbour. And what he saw was 2 magnificent ironclads of the newest type and 4 very fine and heavily armed cruisers, Admiral Qing in command. And I have been urging him strongly to take his fleet and show his flag in foreign ports, especially Australia. But he cannot go further this year than Singapore. He ends off, would this not help your federation? Now, it's not entirely clear whether General Edwards is having a bit of a leg pull of Henry Parkes, or whether in fact he's quite serious. But either way, the context is clear that he thinks that the mere presence of a Chinese imperial squadron would terrorise the Australian colonies into federation very much quicker and make Henry Parkes' job easier. So that's the kind of international context in which the Australian colonies is operating. This is very clear that they're very aware of the numbers of people in China and India as well, and feared for their existence in a way that wasn't just about people living in Sydney or Melbourne. But this came out nevertheless on a domestic side very much in this kind of stereotyping. And this cartoon, another bulletin cartoon, is a very famous one, and it's often reproduced even today to show any fear that people have of a particular force. In this case, the force was Chineseness, or Chinese people. And you can see from this kind of stereotyping, the kind of negativity, the contrariness of it, the self-serving basis upon which this kinds of fears existed. And I point this out to show not just what people thought. The cartoon itself, for example, was drawn by an English cartoonist who only just recently arrived in Australia, and so it was just simply being told this stuff by the editors of the bulletin, and drew this up presumably on the basis of what they were telling him. But the significant thing about this cartoon, or this thinking that goes into this, is how successful it was, not just in making people think Chinese people negatively about Chinese people, but also kind of whitewashing that's influenced even our thinking today. By which I mean, not that we think these things about Chinese people, but that we narrow our view of what was possible for Chinese people within Chinese Australian history. So we don't realise, we think that these things are true, that Chinese people were simply workers, were market gardeners, that they smoked opium, they were gambling, and that maybe people were unfair about it, but this is the kind of world within which people lived. And really, that's not true. There was a much broader world, and we haven't quite overthrown this whitewashing that's gone on as a result of this racist stereotyping, and also, of course, the White Australia policy, which I'll talk about later on. And I want to give an example of what I mean by this, the power of this whitewashing, when I show, if you look at the octopus here, and then you look at Chinese opera in Australia. And now I've mentioned this before, this idea that Chinese opera existed in Australia. And I don't mean just there was occasional performances. I mean, these were performances that existed right around Australia, reached their peak at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Advertised in the English language newspapers, were seen by Europeans, often put on specially for Europeans in some of the small country towns. And people were aware of it and knew about it, made jokes about it. They didn't always appreciate what they were seeing, but they certainly realised it was part of the overall Chinese Australian community. Something that we've forgotten, and forgotten so well that we kind of find it difficult to believe that this was a normal part of the history. You can see here from where the locations were where Chinese opera existed, beginning in the goldfields of Victoria, but by the end of the 19th century, going up and down the east coast, particularly in northern Queensland. And it wasn't just about touring groups from China either. This was a hall in Surrey Hills in Sydney where a local group trained and performed. The Liao Tian Barn would perform, and it would put on operas usually paid for by a merchant or a rich group. They would pay for them to perform, and then it was free for anyone to go in and see. And then they also played in Sydney, Castlereagh Street, Sonic Hall, and other places, and then would tour up into Queensland as well and visit small towns and put on performances for hospitals and other benefits as well, which was a common style of theatrical performance in the 19th century. In fact, it was so connected with the local community that there's even an account here of European women performing on stage, according to this Chinese report. Performance with 8 Western beauties dancing like swallows with full makeup appeared before an audience in Sydney over many nights in 1898. And so this is this is part of obviously the integration of the communities here. Not that Chinese opera is performed by everybody, but nevertheless it's within an element of the community. It's very common. But this fact was only mentioned in the Chinese language newspapers and wasn't, as far as I can see, mentioned in the Sydney's English language press. So Why? Why is these aspects of Chinese-Australian history being forgotten? And of course, the answer is to do with the Federation, the White Australia policy, and the dictation test. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about what that actually meant. So the Commonwealth of Australia passed its Immigration Restriction Act in 1901. This was an act that was resisted by London, mostly in the interests of its relations with its colony of India, which of course were nominally all British subjects, and therefore should have been free to come to Australia as they wished, and also with the Empire of Japan, which was considered an ally of England, of Britain at the time. So in the interest of London's resistance, the colonies in Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia, agreed to impose a dictation test, which was the idea was to have racially based immigration restrictions, but without referring to any particular race or country by name, as, for example, the Labor Party would have preferred. And so who was to be admitted to Australia was going to be left entirely to the discretion of officials. And there were exemptions, but they were few and mostly temporary. And an interesting feature to remember is that for Chinese people who were already resident in Australia before 1901, they were allowed to remain, they weren't to be expelled, and they would come in and out of Australia as well, if they wished, provided they could get a certificate, which was known as the certificate exempting the dictation test. And this is very important for the continuity of the Chinese Australian community, and also how it evolved in the 20th century. So the idea of the dictation test, exactly how fraudulent it was, it was well known at the time, although it has again been one of these things that have been a bit forgotten as years go by. This is again another bulletin cartoon in which they were discussing the dictation test, and they defined it as Australia's lie for Britain's sake. It's not the colour, it's the spelling. And so when they referred to the spelling, they of course meant the dictation test. And what the dictation test was literally this 50 words or so that would be dictated to a person at dictation speed, supposedly, and they were expected to write it down, or rather they weren't expected to write it down. And having failed to write it down, they would be then classified as a prohibited immigrant. They just say literally they were accused of or convicted of a crime, having failed to pass the test. The exception, of course, is if you get a dictation certificate exempting the dictation test. And just to emphasise what a dictation test was, it was literally a blank sheet of paper, because the idea being that if you were possibly to begin to write down the words being dictated to you, that your English was sufficient, or if you could read and write in English, then the test would simply be given in another language. And it could be given in any European language or any prescribed language. And this is an example of a test given in Estonian in 1952 to a Chinese person who had been living in Australia for about a year or so, working as a cook in various cafes before he was given the dictation test and therefore arrested as a prohibited immigrant. And the test could be given in many languages: Greek, Italian, Estonian, Swedish, even Scots Gaelic, in a famous test, which we'll talk about later on when that comes up in the 1930s. Now, just before we move on, again, it's important to realise that the White Australia policy, of course, affected a large number of people, not just Chinese people. And in particular, it's interesting to look at the situation of the South Sea Islanders, who had been coming to Australia for many years. Some 62,000 had been brought over many years to work in Queensland in various industries. But they were told that they had to leave. In fact, there was even a special act, the Pacific Islanders Act, that was enacted to try and get rid of some 9,000 or more Pacific Islanders that were in Australia in 1901. Like many of these things, it wasn't entirely successful. Some 2,000 managed to remain, and they're now the nucleus of the present-day Pacific Islander community in Australia. So that was one example of quite a different treatment of one group compared to the Chinese. Similarly, with those working in the pearl shell industry, just to show the pragmatic attitudes of the White Australia policy. Around 1900, there were some 3,000 people living in Broome, for example, which was a major centre of the pearl shell industry, of either Asian or Southeast Asian origin, as well as Indigenous people, and about 1,000 white people. Broome's Chinatown was quite flourishing with pearl sheds and eatery and entertainment for the divers of this industry. And this was allowed under the White Australia policy and continued right through the period, despite various efforts to try and turn it into a white-only industry, which failed, like many other efforts to do this. Quite a number of efforts to try and exclude people from various industries. In this case, it failed, simply because the idea was that white people couldn't do this kind of work. And just to remember, when we're talking about pearls, we're not talking about pearls as such, we're talking about pearl shell made into buttons. This was the major industry. And Broome was one of the centres, as was Darwin and Thursday Island. Now, the other thing is that just as it's not pearls, it's pearl shell rather than pearls, Chinese in Australia were not just market gardeners. And this is, again, something that's worth emphasising, because, again, the whitewashing of the history has kind of given us a very narrow view of what Chinese people were doing in Australia. Not only were they not just market gardeners, although at one stage perhaps 40% of Chinese working in Australia were working as market gardeners, and many did do that for short periods of time while they did other businesses. It was a very lucrative business. But they also worked, of course, in tin, was very important, gold, continued to do prospecting, railways in the Northern Territory, market gardening, of course, boat building, fishing, carpentry, cooks, and barbers were all some of the occupations that people worked at. Trip hanging off the coast of Queensland, opera, as I mentioned before. Temples, not just having temples, but people had to build these temples, had to stock them and look after them. Newspapers, and many Chinese language newspapers were established at the end of the 19th and in the early period of the 20th century. International trade, as I mentioned, trade networks around pearl shelling, hawking, moving around, selling goods around the countryside. Tobacco, corn and bananas. At one point, and in certain regions, Chinese farmers dominated some of these industries for various periods of time. Scrub cutting, again, was very important. Chinese labour gangs were very well organised and it wasn't a question of them necessarily being paid less. It was simply being that they were better at the job they did, and so were worth the money they were paid. Medicine, Chinese doctors were very popular, particularly in Victoria. And gambling, again, gambling was something seen as a crime, but of course someone had to run these gambling establishments and make money out of it. And this is all part of the occupations people did. Shopkeeping was very important, and some rural towns survived only on the Chinese networks of shops. Stores. Banking, not just domestic banking, but also remittances, as money was sent back to the villages. And it's not unsurprising that some of these Chinese businesses set up banking industries, insurance industries in Hong Kong and Shanghai in a later period. Christian missions, again, not just about white missionaries trying to convert people to Christianity. Chinese Christians became missionaries themselves, set up their own churches, and tried to convert people as well. Community organisations become very important. They always were important on a dialect basis, but they become more general. Chinese organisations for helping people, not just clubs, but they help people to go back to China if they were sick, help pay them money, and help them deal with immigration matters. Political organisations, of course, become important at this time. Again, reform of the Qing and later revolutionary organisations. Smuggling, you're going to have a £100 poll tax, then that means people are going to try and avoid that tax, and this has to be organised. And they weren't hit and miss organisations; they were syndicates that operated from Australia back to Hong Kong and back into the villages. Restaurants were very popular, not just cheap eateries, but also some high-end businesses in Sydney and Melbourne. And finally, interpreters, again, dealing with mainland English-speaking officialdom. Interpreters in the courts were always important from Gold Rush period right up into the 20th century. So you can see there's quite a range of occupations that people are dealing with. And numbers too are also important. You can see in the period from 1881 to 1891, you've got some 11,000 people living in, Chinese people living in Queensland, similar number in New South Wales, similar number in Victoria, and smaller numbers scattered around other parts of Australia. So all over Australia, tin mining down in Tasmania, for example. The poll taxes and the restrictions are already beginning to bite, and you can see some decline in numbers in Queensland and Victoria, but New South Wales is still continuing to increase, mainly because of people coming down from Queensland into New South Wales. And the thing to remember about these people, these thousands of people, tens of thousands of people around Australia, is that although we, as I say, in history, we talk about them as being Chinese people, they themselves thought of themselves as being from particular districts and dialect groups. So they were Zhongshan people, Siyap people, Samyap people, Dongguan or Gaoyao people, and others. And this is important. They think of themselves more and more as Chinese as time goes by, but in this period, this is important. It's important for who you relate to, it's important to who your children will marry, important for many reasons. Mostly came via Hong Kong, from southern China through Hong Kong, but also down through to Singapore, particularly to Western Australia. And overall, a lot of these numbers seem large. They're never more than about 2% of the population, although in particular areas, much larger. So Cairns at one point had more than 50% Chinese population, as did Darwin. So it varied depending on where people were, but in general, the numbers were quite small in percentage terms. Now, in the period leading up to Federation, see again, the increased poll taxes of 1881 are having more of an effect. There's declines now in New South Wales. Victoria, Tasmania also is going down. Queensland's up a little bit in numbers, again, probably because of people moving across from the Northern Territory into Queensland. West Australia continues to grow. You can see the enforcement of these restrictions are not uniform. New South Wales and Victoria are much more keen at trying to enforce anti-Chinese legislation. West Australia, not so much at this period. And what's more important here, you can see in the square brackets, I've got numbers there, 100 in Queensland, 100 in New South Wales. These are the numbers of Chinese women that are in Australia. So a small number compared to the number of men. But more significant is the number of Chinese family couples. That is to say, men who are married to local women in Queensland or New South Wales or wherever. So New South Wales had an estimated at this period 1,000 Chinese family couples. Queensland, similar number. Victoria, some 700. Now, this is significant because this means families, this means people being born, and this will have a big impact on the makeup of the population of the community in later decades. Of course, not so much now, but later on as they grow up, you have much more of a range of mix, not people just China-born, but Australian-born and others. So then in the period after Federation, after the beginning of the White Australia policy leading up to 1911, you've got declines all around Australia, significant declines, particularly in Queensland and Victoria, as excuse me, as people return to China, retire, and new numbers of people are not allowed to come in, or relatively few numbers are brought in. There's always people coming in, but certainly the numbers are much down on what they had been previously. So the communities begin to decline. Although because of urbanisation, some of the numbers in Sydney and Melbourne begin to grow as people come from the rural areas into the urban centres. But the important thing to remember that in this period, they're becoming more mixed. There are people who are Australian-born and Australian-raised, but there are also people who are China-born and raised. There are people who are Australian-born but raised in China. There are people born in China, but then are brought to Australia when young and raised basically in Australia. And so, of course, there are many people mixed parentage, which means they have different choices, different ways of identifying themselves. And it's important to remember that they have then a mixture of different ways of communicating. Some are bilingual, some are monolingual, some speak a dialect, some speak just Cantonese, some speak only English, or some mixture of all of these. And this, again, is important to how people communicate and relate to each other and the choices they have in their lives. It's never as simple as simply being Chinese or not. So this brings us to the other important question: is what perspective do we view all these things? Do we look at it from a white perspective or a Chinese perspective? Or do we look at, of course, both? If we look at it from a white perspective, which is very common in the history, then Chinese people in Australia are going to be seen as either victims or as resistors. So we're going to focus on things like discrimination, resistance, and accommodation. And there's going to be ongoing history of things of social and legal racism is going to be emphasised. Opium organisations, challenges, smuggling, for example, all of this is going to be part of the history, and all of this is part of the history. But if you look at it from a Chinese perspective, you're going to see things a little bit differently. You're going to see Chinese people as earners. As I say, their main aim in coming to Australia was to earn money for their families in China by and large, or people had other choices. They're going to be simply, of course, human beings struggling with the various aspects of modern life. In this case, modernity. This is a period of time when many things were changing. There were revolutions, there was democracy, there was electricity and telephones. All kinds of things were happening to change the world at this time. And people knew that. Chinese people knew that as well as Australians, European Australians. And so, in particular, when they're looking at China, They're looking at increasingly a sense that things need to reform, not just politically, but also culturally, and even to perhaps revolution. It's a period then where things like, say, the Big Four are being founded. That's to say, major department stores and businesses and industries that will have a significant impact in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Yeah, more about that in a later lecture. Family, of course, continues to be important. Novels are written, newspapers are established, which are full of all kinds of news and arguments and debates. Picnics, people go off and entertain themselves and enjoy modern life. It's all about then human diversity and individuality. And now, very often the one way to try and convey this human diversity and individuality is to focus on particular families or particular individuals. But that kind of gives us a continually individual view. But I still like to have an overview of what's going on. So what I'll do instead is give you a quick rundown of what's happening. Oops, I'm not losing my power here. Here we go. So just to try and convey a sense of the human diversity within the Chinese Australian community in this period. Now we have, of course, market gardeners. Now we always know the market gardener stereotype, and they certainly existed and were very important, particularly for vegetable production. It's not too much of an exaggeration to say that the vegetables for Australians at this period of time were largely grown, not exclusively, but nevertheless, certainly the Chinese market gardeners did dominate. But they did other things. They played football, for example. This is a Chinese football team down in Victoria. Another stereotype has to do with carpentry and carpenters, but people did other things such as raced and rode the modern device of the bicycle. Always, it's important to remember that people had family in the villages, and what they were doing was sending money back. And while many people in Australia regarded a market gardener as a very poor, humble kind of job that didn't earn much money, in China, they were making a lot of money. And this is a house built by a Sydney market gardener, for example, in a street full of houses of a similar style, and they were considered to be quite wealthy. And this is what they were doing with their money. They were expanding the family, making the family wealthier, more comfortable, even more prestige. And this is, again, an important part of the connection and the link and people's reasons for doing what they did. As I said, they also entertained themselves. They went around the countryside. They had picnics. This was a network of shopkeepers within a rural network who were taking annual picnics for the staff, both white and Chinese in this context. I've mentioned opera, of course, as entertainment and also as money earners and cultural relevance there, as does his temples. This is a temple from, there were 5 temples established in Tasmania, for example, on the basis of the wealth earned from tin mining. And what people did was they would go back to China and bring all this material back in order to stock the temple with it was quite luxurious artifacts and images. Family, again, is important. And as I say, mixed family, mixed race families, mixed cultural families, with children growing up knowing a variety of languages and a variety of cultural backgrounds. Politics, again, increasingly important. The reform of the Qing, and these were international organisations, not just kind of local groups within Sydney, but they were groups that were established, I think, back to China, but also around the Pacific and all around Southeast Asia as well. Again, individuals did all kinds of things. This is William Marquette, who was the first Chinese Australian barrister down in Victoria. And so he went his own way, and many others became professionals also, although very often they chose to do their professional careers in Hong Kong or in Singapore, although William Marquette remained in Melbourne. And finally, of course, business is very important. Wide ranges of businesses that were both domestic. This is a Sydney-based store, the Wong Wah Chong, but this store also had branches in Hong Kong and in Sheki in southern China, and it sent remittances and played a major role within the community, both in terms of the goods it sold, the international trade it did, and also the connections and the support it gave to people within the community. But it was Zhongshan based. So it did this for the Zhongshan community, one particular dialect group, and other stores, other businesses did so for other groups within the community. So still a mixture, although the proprietor of the store, the owner, Philip Lee Chong, also considered himself as part of a wider Chinese business community and began to join and to help organise overall businesses that consider themselves to be Chinese in a broader broader sense. So very much a period of change and evolution. Now, I talk about the range of activities that are happening here and having a Chinese perspective, but I don't want to then downplay racism. And so I just want to emphasize here some of the kind of underpinnings of racism, or at least give an example of how the racism would have influenced people on a daily basis, even while they were doing a range of other things, how this worked on a social and a legal basis. And also to emphasize that this was never consistent. There were always exceptions. So it's an inconsistency here that makes it, that should be kept a bit more in mind. We shouldn't try to make things too simple. So to illustrate racism, this is an observation made by a magistrate who was hearing a case of some gamblers, some Chinese gamblers had been arrested. And he was sympathetic to the gamblers. And so he said, if a Chinaman went to a play or a picture show, he usually was to be found in one of the dearest seats, no doubt to protect himself from the unwelcome attentions he would receive in other parts of the house. So for this magistrate, he well knew that it wasn't even possible for a Chinese person to simply go along to the theatre without finding himself being harassed, and that he probably had needed to find the dearest seats. But for his point of view, they were gambling because their range of activities, the range of entertainments they had was relatively restricted. So it was a kind of an illustration of a social aspect of the racism. Now, for the legal aspect, this is often very hard to illustrate. We know that the dictation test was very uniform and consistent and existed over many years. But there were many other laws that were kind of seen as racist and directed against Chinese and other people, but we're not totally sure how effective, what impact they had. Nevertheless, the context is clear. So this is a law introduced by the federal government for the idea of paying bounties on particular crops that they wanted to encourage to be grown. And the law said we will only pay the bounty if these crops have been grown or produced by white labour only. So a clearly racist law. But they had to immediately bring in an exception, a qualification to this, because obviously, how are you going to get things grown by white labour only, particularly in areas where white labour wasn't very keen to grow things. And so the exception was that, oh, well, that's okay, as long as if the employment of any Aboriginal native of Australia or of any coloured person born in Australia and having one white parent, then the bounty could continue to be paid. So this makes it very difficult to see exactly what impact such laws had. They were certainly a racist content, but very often probably not a great deal of impact. And many of these kind of laws were in fact withdrawn after relatively short periods of time because they were simply unworkable. But the other thing I want to point out is the exceptions to all this kind of underlying racism. This was West Australia. Foundation stone of the Zhonghua Association was laid this afternoon by the very aptly named Sir Ed Stone, Lieutenant Governor. And this official recognition of the Chinese communities was very common all around Australia. It happened in Victoria, happened in Tasmania, Queensland, and other places. So, with all kinds of social and legal racism going on and discriminations, you've also got acceptance and even some cooperation going on. So again, nothing is very consistent within this history. But we do get some clear examples of some things that are happening. And now I said before that because of urbanisation, the Chinese population of Sydney and Melbourne actually began to grow, even as the overall population was declining. And this caused some problems within these urban centres. And so in May 1904, an anti-Chinese league or an anti-Asiatic league was established. And this was an amalgamation of both small businesses and trade union people to kind of try and pressure and attack Chinese businesses, particularly shops, carpenter businesses and so forth. And the interesting result of this particular league, two things happened. One was that these leagues were so keen that they actually sent people out into the countryside, where they often were disappointed and found that in the countryside people weren't so keen to do this kind of discrimination. They were quite happy to have cheap laundry done or have them get the credit from a business that was run by a well-established Chinese family. But in Sydney, on the other hand, in July, soon after the Anti-Chinese League was established, the Sydney Chinese Merchants formed their own association, the New South Wales Chinese Merchants Defence Association, to attack and to defend against this kind of discrimination. So not only is that interesting in terms of the way they responded, but of course it's also interesting in that they call themselves the Chinese Merchants Defence Association. So again, it's another example of this early kind of umbrellaing everybody under a banner of being Chinese. The other more characteristic way people dealt with this kind of discrimination was to try and deal with it by accommodating. And one of the most interesting aspects of this was the New South Wales Chinese Anti-Opium League. So the Chinese merchants had realised that opium had become a kind of was seen as something that only the Chinese did, and it was leading to great disrespect of the Chinese community. They themselves necessarily didn't, of course, like the idea of people using opium, but it had been perfectly legal up until this period of time. It had always been legal in Australia to import it and to sell it. So this New South Wales Chinese Anti-Opium League succeeded in getting opium banned in New South Wales in 1906. And they did this they were hoping to raise the prestige of the Chinese community. They did it by working with people like W.E. Johnson there, who in fact was a prime supporter of the White Australia policy. So again, much inconsistency going on here as people struggle to deal with a changing environment. Now, part of that environment was one of both local and international anxiety, at least as far as the Chinese community was concerned. So in 1900, for example, two things happened. There was an outbreak of plague in Sydney, and also the Boxer Rebellion began in China. And both these things caused much anxiety for the Chinese people of Sydney, for example. So Sydney City Council responded to the plague by tearing down a lot of houses, destroying an area of Sydney around Surrey Hills, particularly Wexford Street disappeared, and it evicted many Chinese residents without compensation. And this caused a lot of course, anger, as you can imagine, and it made, at one point, for fear among the Chinese community that they were going to be expelled from the city completely. This didn't happen, but they did fear this at one point. Similarly, with the Boxer Rebellion, which was targeted largely at Europeans in China, including many deaths as a result, this caused some anxiety for the Chinese community, who felt that they were then being targeted as enemies of Europeans. Now, the Chinese community responded to this by actually contributing to the New South Wales contingent. So the New South Wales Regiment sent, as did Victoria and other places, sent a contingent to Beijing to help defend the Europeans against the Boxers, and the Sydney Chinese community actually supported this. But they did this not because they were trying just to get in good with Europeans. They did this because they perceived the Boxers as being an anti-modern movement. They did not appreciate necessarily the aims of the Boxers. And this meant that they were in a kind of a bit of a quandary. Just as an aside here, to illustrate this is a bell from a temple in Beijing that's now in the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, brought back by that same New South Wales contingent as a bit of spoils of war. So, reform or revolution? For the Chinese elite in Sydney and Melbourne and around Australia, it was about modernity, it was about reform. The Boxer Rebellion did a great deal of damage to those that were supporting the reform of the Qing, and more increasingly people began to argue for revolution, for a need to completely change China. They argued this through various tools of modernity, which of course included the newspapers. There were many newspapers established. The Dunghua Times was one that tended to go for a more conservative view, and others argued for more revolutionary views. And this was the context within which people are operating as we come towards the beginning of the end of the last decade of the 20th century. Now, how this modernity played itself out is interesting. I'll just give one example of that in the case of this man named Wang Shiping. Now, Wang Shiping was the son of a Chinese gold miner, a man who had left the village and come to Victoria, worked as a gold miner and been very successful. Gone back to China, come back to Victoria, set up businesses in Melbourne, and his son had been educated, was a Christian, and his son in turn had also come to Victoria, where he worked as an editor of a newspaper, and where he promoted Christianity. He was a missionary. He travelled around Australia trying to convert people. He was a proponent of revolutionary republicanism. He wanted to reform China completely. He believed China needed to modernise, not just politically, but also culturally. And one of these was also that women should be more equal. So this was a very strong thing that he argued for, as did many others at this time. And he even wrote a novel at one stage, The Poison of Polygamy, which he serialised in his newspaper around 1909 and 1910. So all the tools of modernity were being employed by Wang Shiping, and he was by no means an exception in this period. And so you can see that people had choices, and choices were to be made, choices about where to go, what to do, and how to identify themselves. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say then this period, 1981 to 1911, was both, as I said before, both a high and a low point in Chinese Australian history, transformed by both the rise in white nationalism in Australia and also by modernity and the rise of republicanism in China. I say rise, or the rise at least of revolutionary movements within China. And all of this meant that choices had to be made, choices both imposed upon people as well as those to be made by themselves. Choices such as to assimilate, and many people did. Many families erased the Chinese past. Even today, there are people finding out, unbeknownst to them, that they had Chinese ancestors, grandfathers and great-grandfathers going back into the 19th century that had been eliminated as people chose to assimilate and to change their names and to ignore their Chinese past. But many others, of course, chose to stick within the Chinese community, to return to China, to maintain language, and to deal with this continuing transnational history that had been evolving. Others, of course, took up more of a halfway positions. Perhaps they lost their language, but not their identity, or they evolved new identities. And as always, it's difficult to determine proportions. We can describe various individuals who did various things, but it's very difficult to always say, that most people did this or most people did that. But we should be aware of the range of possibilities as we look through the history. And so I'll just leave you then there with a list of readings, suggested readings. If you want to do more, or you can look on the Chinese Australian History website to find out these bibliographies and things. And otherwise, I will now say thank you very much for your attention and hand back to Jin to perhaps if we have some questions or whatever to go through. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, Michael. It's really interesting. And you can see that it's so packed with content, of lots of things you could elaborate more, like a dictation test and opera and the novel, quite a few things. So it's full of events and history. It's really rich history. It's very, very interesting. And now we open to questions. I have a few questions on the Q&A already, and then I have a couple of questions myself. So I'll start with the viewers' questions first. The first one is from Rich. He says, in view of the white Australian policy, was there an attempt to expel and repatriate the Chinese already living in Australia, similar to Pacific Islanders?
Well, no, the treatment of the Chinese was quite different in comparison to Pacific Islanders, who were targeted and meant to be expelled. What did happen, though, was they did try to kind of squeeze people out of particular jobs. This particularly happened up in Darwin, for example, where the Chinese population was much larger. And so there were efforts to, for example, close down the fishery industry at one stage. And there were efforts to kind of squeeze people out of the pearl industry that didn't work. Various efforts. There were laws about, not working, carrying mails, the post office, unless you were white, and this kind of thing. So this, of course, made it difficult, but it never got to the point of actually trying to expel anybody. There was a brief period where it looked like they weren't going to give certificates or exemptions to people, and they were going to have to leave and not come back. But that, in fact, caused quite a bit of anxiety among, well, not just the Chinese community, but others, because they realized that would be all the market gardeners would be disappearing and they wouldn't be coming back to grow vegetables. So in fact, they changed and relaxed the laws and made sure that pretty well anybody who had been resident in Australia before 1901 would get a certificate of exemption and would therefore be allowed to return to Australia if they wished. Nevertheless, they did make it difficult sometimes when people were coming back. People had to be fingerprinted, searched. They were often suspected of being not who they said they were. And so some people were not allowed to enter Australia who perhaps were in fact eligible. So there were certainly individual cases where it made it difficult, and perhaps it's hard to tell how many people just chose not to come back because it was too difficult or just too much bureaucracy or just didn't want to go through the hassle. But there certainly wasn't a kind of concerted effort to throw large numbers of people out, and certainly nothing like what happened with the Pacific Islanders, no.
Okay, the next question from Darryl. The Chinese were also pioneering in many industries in Australia, especially in the sugarcane industry, banana industry, etc. This adds to your point that they were engaged in many other activities than market gardeners. Hence, your point on whitewashing of Chinese occupations is a deeper one. One connects to their pioneering nature, or considers their pioneering nature. How should we address this?
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, I've tried to address it by kind of emphasising things like opera and other things, just to say things are well outside the usual stereotype of market gardening, trying to get through to people that there was a lot more going on than this. Other people do by looking at individuals and going through life stories, and this is a good way for people to get an idea. They look at the history of a person's life and begin to realise that it was a lot more to this person's life than simply working on a market garden or being a victim of racism. So the more we promote these kinds of things, the better. But I think it's very hard to get through to people's minds because, as I say, I've been working in the academic field for many years, and this material is all there. For the last 20 years, there's been many, many good academic papers and books published that show all this to a fair degree. But it doesn't penetrate with the popular history or the popular mindset very much. People continue to think Chinese gold, Chinese market gardens, and they don't go much beyond that. I think all we can do is continue to have venues like this to continue to try and popularise things. Recently, I saw the ABC had a very interesting program called How Tough Was Your Ancestors? I hadn't realised this before, and it's a children's program. And the idea is to pick someone's ancestor, show what terrible things they were doing back in the 19th century, making kids do, and get kids to do the same thing. And I thought it was really quite a wonderful way of doing things, particularly trying to target younger kids to show that. But again, the ABC are not historians, so they were looking at a market gardener actually. But they did include someone doing not opera but performance. So again, they were mixing market gardening with performance, sword dance. So it was a step, and again, it's step by step stuff. So the ABC is telling stories and trying to entertain people. So that was an improvement. They can do better. And I think we've got to just continue to push at this and make things improve our awareness bit by bit. And I think with people's increasing interest, particularly so many people aware of their Chinese heritage or of Chinese heritage, they're more wired to accept some of this stuff and to know that the history is a lot broader than simply market gardeners and racism and so forth.
Okay, next a question from Andrew. Andrew asks, are there any records to indicate what experts Chinese Australians thought about the decline and eventual extinction of the Qing dynasty?
Oh, well, yes, in the Chinese language newspapers, there's a lot of material. They're arguing about it all the time. I mean, as I said, some newspapers took a more conservative stance and some newspapers more revolutionary. So they constantly argued back and forth about what should happen. And of course, there was this increasing sense that the Qing were Manchu. That is to say that they were foreigners. They weren't Chinese, they weren't Han Chinese, they were foreign occupiers. And so this increased and this was argued out in the newspapers as well. So yes, certainly in terms of the newspapers, there's a lot of material. There's not a lot outside those newspapers. So we're getting the view then of a certain educated elite, but they were the ones that were most concerned with politics. As you'd expect, a lot of people who just intent on looking after their family and going back to the villages perhaps didn't want to concern themselves too much with the higher politics, and only when they were forced to after the revolution gave them no choice. But yes, there certainly is a lot of interesting material there, which hasn't been translated very much. We could do a lot more. Poison and Polygamy was from the newspapers, for example, that book, and that was translated, and that gives us a particular view about the Qing and the Manchu. But there's a lot more material that we could be, should be translating. Trouble is, it's difficult to translate this material because it's written in an old style, very often literary Chinese, sometimes in dialect, and we don't really have a lot of people who are good or are able to do these translations very well. But certainly we can encourage doing that, and I think we should.
The next question I can answer that is asking the available, do we have available lecture 1 and 2? And yes, we do. It's on our website. So it's all being recorded. And so you're more than welcome to get onto the website and watch all the first 3. Next, a question from Peter. And that's an interesting question about the, bilateral relations in a way. So how would you evaluate the contribution of Chinese people to to the changes in Australia over this period? Equally, how did Australian experiences influence development in China?
How would I evaluate the contribution of Chinese people to the change in Australia? Well, yes, it's interesting. It depends where you look, of course, but I mean, certainly in the north, tremendous impact in northern Queensland and in the Northern Territory. And not just vegetables, but growing of a whole range of crops, opening up many industries, many territories around Atherton and so forth. Very often what would happen is that, say Atherton, for example, it was with white farmers would own the land, but they would lease it out to Chinese to do all the work, to do the, I mean, very often these market gardens, for example, were taking over rough land and doing all the work to turn it into cultivatable land, which would then later be taken over by white farmers to do the easier growing. So, I mean, the Chinese were doing a lot of heavy work, scrub cutting, the clearing of the land, particularly in Queensland, was very important in the 19th century as people tried to turn this into an agricultural producing area. And that meant chopping down trees and clearing the scrub. And that was very hard work. And again, the Chinese gangs mostly did that kind of work. So a lot of impact in that area. Railways in the Northern Territory, partly built by Chinese labour, not on the scale of in America, but nevertheless a significant contribution in this area. So yes, quite a range of impacts, but by and large, a lot of it had to do. I mean, I didn't first talk about a lot. The other more negative impact is, of course, this othering. There's this kind of hammering out of this idea of whiteness against the Chinese. This idea that we're not Chinese. What are we? We are Australians, and Australian, by definition, is this kind of white, non-Chinese thing. So there's a strong element of that, which was what the whitewashing was serving to do, was to establish Australians' images of themselves. I haven't kind of focused on that too much in this lecture, but I will more in the next one, that how this is, in many ways, Chinese were the anvil against which the white Australia was established. And this is a psychological thing as much as any kind of practical matter of reducing numbers or turning Australia into a homogenous country demographically.
I inserted one of my questions because at the end of the lecture, you talked about assimilation and what happened to all these Chinese migrants in the end. Some are assimilated and others not, and returning all sorts. So just reminds me, because there are so many Chinese back then, the number obviously led to a strong sense of a resentment or discrimination. That's part of it. How come there were no assimilation intention? What I'm referring to, the government did a systematic assimilation to indigenous population. Why there was none? I mean, not necessarily a good thing, but I'm just curious to know. Why
the Chinese population wasn't treated the same way as the Aboriginal population?
Why didn't they try to,
taking children and so
white Australia, and why didn't they assimilate, Chinese in that way?
Well, I think two reasons. One was that they never looked upon Chinese quite so contemptuously as they did Aboriginal people. I mean, the white attitude towards Aboriginal people was very contemptuous and very much like these people have no rights. They're barely human. There's certainly nothing in their culture. I mean, they might dislike Chinese people as an individual or in racist terms, but they never were quite that contemptuous. And of course, they recognised that they relied on them for a whole range of things. So they never attempted to suppress Chinese culture. Their attitude was much more segregationist than assimilationist. So what they would do, if they could, and this went back to the Gorish time, was not so much to assimilate Chinese people, but simply put them in a separate area. They're happy with, so that's why you have Chinatowns or Chinese areas, and this idea that, that's just where the Chinese live. That's okay as long as they stay in that area. Although, of course, they never were exclusively Chinese Chinatowns, these places. They were often just simply poor areas or a particular town or area where a lot of poor people live, working class and semi-slum areas. And so, in fact, you had a mixture of Chinese and non-Chinese people living together, and often living, well, I won't say harmoniously, but they weren't necessarily antagonistic to each other in the same way, say, a middle-class white person happened to be just walking through the Chinatown and writing a newspaper report might sound. They go past and think, oh, these people are terrible, these people are dirty, blah, 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 and then go home. I mean, there's other people who live right next door, and they live in very similar circumstances, and so they never describe things quite that way. So it's much more segregationist more than anything else. Although again, Australia certainly didn't have any policy like that. There was no separate schools, for example. These Chinese kids grew up; they just went to the local school. Whereas Aboriginal children very often weren't allowed to go to these same schools. There was a separation, and they found it much more difficult with education. So again, very, very different attitude. There's no comparison between the way Chinese people were looked at and Aboriginal people. It's two different completely worlds. But a good question, because it does bring up that situation that there's racism, but it's not a uniform racism. It's very much a pragmatic thing in a way of dealing with people in a different
that's
different
really
workplace.
interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Natalie has a question. Michael, thanks for the comprehensive overview. In terms of merchants, could you explain a bit about their role in terms of organizing Chinese communities? And from your research, have you found that many Chinese merchants came as merchants, or they came as laborers, but gained a social status and became merchants? Were there much social mobility within Chinese communities?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question. Just to answer the second part first, yes. I mean, we certainly have stories of people who came as labourers and worked and then became merchants. So there's this kind of classic style of people, gradually saving money and becoming very wealthy from a very humble beginnings. And this is a very common story right around the Chinese diaspora of people doing that. But it's also true that people often did come with capital, or even if they did work for periods of time, they were working because they were working for an uncle or a father who had the money. And so they might well have spent their time working as labourers, but they never had access to the capital and labour through family networks that allowed them to kind of increase their wealth over time, buy out partnerships. So it's hard to tell exactly what's happening. The story is usually told in terms of poor to rich, from rags to riches kind of tale, because that's the classic migrant tale where everybody tells this story, and it's very common within Chinese communities. But I suspect when you take into account their networks and their ability to borrow money from relatives and do this kind of thing, which is all part of the community way of working. This is important. They weren't complete lone wolves who just did it all themselves. They weren't self-made men in the kind of the American style necessarily. I mean, I'm sure there were a few, but they certainly worked hard, but they used their networks, they used their connections. They started with partnerships, and perhaps as people returned to China, they bought those partnerships out and eventually became the sole owners and therefore wealthy merchants in their own right, as they then took all the profits. They, of course, had the ability to do that, but they did it within a certain social context, which I think is important. The other part of the question about in terms of organising the communities, yes, the merchant class was absolutely important. They were the ones, again, it was a hierarchical kind of way of looking at things, and the merchants were considered to be the ones that were responsible for the community. So you was, again, it's part of this networking. So you had a Zhongshan group, for example, or Lungdu group, and yes, the merchants tended to kind of be in control of that organisation, but they did it to help everybody. I mean, everybody was expected to be helped. If someone lost their money or needed help returning, then the community organisation would help them. But the money mainly came from the wealthier merchants. But at the same time, you went to that merchant store and you bought his goods and you paid your remittance through him to go back to send the money back to China, and he, of course, took his 10%. So it all worked. In a way that everybody got something out of it, which is typical of these kind of in communities that operated as Chinese communities had for many years on the village basis, networked, kind of a semi-relative basis. Everybody was an uncle or a cousin or somebody was, if you weren't really related, then you acted as if that person was your uncle, and you expected to get some benefit from that both ways. So yes, certainly the merchant class was very important, but it's just not as easy as saying the rich people did this and the poorer people did that. It's a much more complex cultural mix, which is changing over time, of course. You can't say it's the same all the time. It's certainly evolving, particularly as people begin to be more conscious of being Chinese merchants and the Chinese Chamber of Commerce is established. But it's interesting, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce is established, but it's established with representatives from all the different dialect groups. So it's kind of a compromise when it's first established, but later on that becomes less and less important. But certainly, yes, it's a good question. You've got to look at how these things were operating. But I think the networks and the connections are very important that go right back to the village, back and forth all the time. So family relations are as important as any kind of business relations, or the two are often the same, I think, particularly in this period. Sorry, I've lost you. Gina, are you talking now? I can't hear.
Okay, next question is
Yep.
from Gil. Did the CEDT entitle the holder to bring a child into Australia that was born outside Australia subsequent to the issue of the CEDT? What about spouse?
Sorry, yes, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, it didn't. The CEDT gave you no rights except for yourself. The bringing in of children and wives, this has had to be organised quite separately. There was another certificate called a certificate of exemption, as opposed to a CDT, which people could get to bring in children or wives. It was possible. Usually they were brought in temporarily. There had to be a reason. Like children were often brought in to work, to go to study. Students, usually younger children, go learn English or go to a school. Wives could be brought in. Again, merchants were able to do that, usually for 6 months at a time, but then they could get them extended. Again, not always, it wasn't always possible. People could even were made to leave even when the children were born in Australia. The mothers were made to leave. There were quite a number of cases. So it's quite a complicated business, but that was quite outside the certificate of exemptions, which were specifically for those who had been resident before 1901. After 1901, it's a different ballgame and a much more complicated one, which I will talk about more in the next lecture, where I'll go into that whole system that devolved and how that affected the community and the dealings with the well, not immigration, but the customs house, where the customs officers were the ones in charge right up till after World War II. So yes, it's a complicated situation, but and mostly people couldn't bring in children. Though very often they had children who were born in Australia and they raised them in China and then brought them back again. They did have the right to return in theory, although again, in practice, there was some difficulties there. But by and large, if people had Australian birth, they were able to come in. But it wasn't like America where you could pass on your citizenship through birth. It didn't work that way. You had to be born in Australia to have any rights. Children born in Australia and China had no specific rights at all. Although pragmatically there was some leniency involved, but it was discretionary rather than legal.
Next, a question from Michelle, and she's asking, is that true that the real estate agency LJ Hooker was started by a Chinese person?
Yes, supposedly that's true. Yeah, LJ Hooker was Chinese or part Chinese, and he chose to hide it for many years, and then it came out many years later. The hooker, supposedly the story comes from the position he played in football. He was a hooker, but I don't know the full story, but I have heard the various variations of that story, and it seems to be that particular story is certainly true, but I don't know all the details. Yeah.
Next question, Juanita. She's asking, hi Michael, I feel Chinese as a market gardeners are not necessarily a stereotype. Occupations depended on geographical locations and time, etc. For example, in cities, you found a greater range of occupations, such as the cabinet makers. Or in 1870s to 80s, you found land clearers. In Bathurst, for example, market gardeners was a dominant occupation because rail allowed access to Sydney market. So it sort of depends.
It does depend, Juanita, and that's the point I was trying to make. I think this period is a period of much broader things. This idea of the market gardeners is something that actually happens over time. So by the 1920s, as you're referring to Bathurst and so forth, and the connections to Sydney, yes, you could say around Bathurst there was almost all the Chinese were simply market gardeners because it had been reduced by that stage. But in the period I'm talking about, the late 1880s, around the turn of the century, it's much broader range of occupations. But we think of it in terms of only market gardeners because we're taking that period later on where market gardening becomes to dominate more and more and transplanting it back into a previous generation. So at this period, I wanted to emphasize that market gardening is a stereotype because later on that stereotype does in a sense become true or truer because the range of occupations does reduce. And again, going back to the question about certificates of exemption, people were allowed to come in, but they were allowed to come in if they were substitute for a market garden. The department actually encouraged the replacement of workers on market gardens, but they didn't do that, for example, for carpenters or for other positions because they saw them as competitive with white workers, whereas market gardening was seen as a Chinese job. So within the officialdom, market gardening was seen as Chinese, and therefore they gave it more leniency and allowed more people to come in if they were going to work on a market garden. And there were other reasons as well. So yes, it's true, but I mean, it's true over time. And what I'm trying to emphasize is that it wasn't true for every period. In this particular period, the range of occupations, even in Bathurst, corn growing and other things were much broader than simply market gardening. But market gardening was always important, as I said, even this period at 1.40%, which is quite a large part of your workforce working in one particular area. So it's certainly always significant, but not as overwhelmingly significant as it became, or as it is in people's thinking. That was how I was trying to get that across.
I actually have a question in relation to that, relation to occupations. From the list that you listed, seems like either they depend on stereotype or depends on the circumstances. So what I see is like, are those occupations culture specific? So for example, I don't see pub in there. So,
yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're cultural specific. I think they're specific broadly to people's aims and ideals. So if you're thinking it's still in terms of that your family is in China and that's where your home is, that's where you ultimately want to retire to, or where you want to go back to and establish, then what you're looking for is occupations that you can kind of go in and out of. So market gardening is perfect for this. You don't own the land. There's no need to own a garden. You just lease the land. You work on it with a partnership, maybe with 5 or 10 other people. And if you want to go to China for a couple of years, then you simply sell your share and you go. And then you can go back to China, stay for a couple of years, and then you can come back again and buy another share and start working in market gardening again. And many of these businesses and these occupations are like that. They're flexible, they're good earning. You work hard, but you don't have to kind of tie yourself down. If you're a shopkeeper and you own the business and you're established in the town, then that means you've probably already decided you're going to stay, that your place to live is going to be Australia. So you've got choices that people are making. And in general, a lot of these occupations, I think, are more about where people think of their home is, even if they've been living in Australia for many, many years. Psychologically, they're thinking their home is still in the village. Even people who never end up going back often think in those terms. They send money back. They're involved in the marriages of their cousins and their nieces and nephews and so forth, and they send money for that. So so they're kind of psychologically still thinking in those terms, and this perhaps determines some of the occupations that people are involved in. But there's also this racism, and there's also this sense of what you can deal with. I mean, you're dealing with a wider mainstream society that makes it harder. I mean, people could run pubs. I mean, there certainly were people who did run these kinds of things, but they were individual ones, and certainly wasn't a wide-ranging occupation. Yes, so it depends on how you did. But some people could do it. I mean, not everybody's can run a pub. You have to have a certain kind of personality, and that involves certainly being able to deal with all your customers without too much trouble. And pubs were very rough places in the 19th century. They weren't quite the same as they are today.
I have a couple of quick questions. One is at the very beginning, like there were a lot of Chinese laborers as well as Indians. It didn't seem like Indians copped so much discrimination. Is that because of sheer numbers?
By and large, I think just the numbers. I mean, the Australians, politicians who were talking about federation feared India as much as they did China in terms of numbers, because they could look at the map and knew there were a lot of Indians, and they knew these were British subjects, and the British were kind of pressuring them to treat them well. But the numbers in Australia were very, very tiny. But even those small numbers caused a bit of a stir. I mean, towards the end of the 19th century, there were small numbers of Indian people, small numbers of Japanese people coming into Australia, very tiny in comparison just to the Chinese numbers, and the Chinese numbers weren't all that fantastically high. But that was enough for them to begin to want to bring in legislation to start barring people. They didn't want things to be the thin end of the wedge. They always saw it in terms of, you let a few in and there's going to be a lot more following along. But it wasn't a lot of specific racism again, I think mainly because of numbers, but also, of course, I think we remember that India was part of the empire, and so many Australians were a bit more familiar with India in the 19th century than we realise. We think that, again, because of the whitewashing, that Australia had nothing to do with Asia, nothing to do with other parts of the world. But in fact, it had been long connected with India for many years as part of the empire. Many officials right through the 19th century had worked in India. Many white settlers in Australia had previously lived in India, so they were quite familiar with India and Indians, and didn't fear them or didn't see them as a kind of a hostile alien race. In fact, they probably thought they knew more about India than they did about Chinese in general. They probably didn't know as much as they thought they knew, but since it was all part of that one big happy imperial family, the hostility to Indians wasn't that great. In fact, the greatest fear for Indians was they were often hawkers going around the countryside. And the idea was, we're not too sure who the father of that child is. They were a bit more worried about what they were getting up to as they went around to the farms and knocked on the doors of farmers' wives. So that was the kind of main concern with the Indians at one period of time anyway, in the 19th century.
So I suppose...
No large hostilities, no.
Right. So the fear primarily coming from like not knowing, not understanding.
It's just a general kind of racism that they had, and they're not ignorance of people, but not a widespread fear at that point anyway.
Yeah, I have another question is, now it's it seems to me, a lot of a focus on other occupations rather than just the stereotyped ones, like opera and the cultural elements, other things that Chinese migrants have done. Kind of recently. Do you see why is that the case?
Why the focus on the other?
Yeah, the threat is more recent than before. And what's the driver behind this focus or shift of a focus?
Well, I think people are beginning to realise that. Well, I think it's this shift in perspective. And so, previous history has always been looked at Chinese Australian history from a white perspective. And so it's always been about racism. And so whether you're defending the racism or attacking the racism, you're still saying that the main drivers of this history are white people, and the Chinese are simply victims in some way. But when you start shifting the perspective from a Chinese perspective and say, what are the people whose history this is? What are they thinking? What are they doing? Well, then, of course, you begin to realize that they're thinking and doing different things. They're not spending their life being victims. They're not spending their life worrying about racism. They're spending their life doing a whole lot of things. And yes, racism and being discriminated against is part of that within the Australian context. But they're doing other things. They're traveling, they're working, and then when you begin to look at what people are doing, and when you look at someone's life history or you look at their list of occupations, if you look at these, say, the certificates of exemption from the dictation test, the file asks people to list all their occupations up till 1901 or up to when they made the application. Well, they're not just writing down market gardener all the time. They're writing down a whole lot of different things, and they're usually traveling around a lot. They're usually saying, I live 2 years here and I live 5 years here. They're quite itinerant very often, but doing different things. And so you soon get to realize, if you look carefully at people's individual lives, that they're doing a wide variety of things. And so, yes, I think it's just a shift in perspective that says, we're not talking about history just purely from a white perspective. We're talking about the history from the perspective of the people who are living that history, and that brings in other dimensions as soon as you do that. You going back to the village and wandering around the village and asking people what was going on. How did so and so make his money? How did your grandfather make his money? Well, he did this and he did that. You soon get told what they were doing, and the answer isn't always, he was a market gardener. Sometimes it is, but very often, no. He was a doctor. He was a merchant. He was a buyer. He ran a department store in Hong Kong, and then he came to Australia simply to buy wool. I mean, he was a very different kind of a person than the stereotype would have us believe.
One last question: how did dictation test work? Work very well in deterring or restricting Chinese coming?
Yes, I think so. It was a very effective test. I mean, particularly when you compare it to the loopholes that the Americans had with their so-called Exclusion Act. It was very effective because it was mainly dealt with by the shipping companies, of course. I mean, there are untold numbers of people who simply never got on a boat because they weren't allowed to. They weren't allowed to buy a ticket. The shipping companies very quickly realized that, because they had to take them back. You see, the shipping companies didn't want to risk bringing someone all the way to Sydney or Melbourne, have them given the dictation test, because they were fined £100, the shipping company, and they then had to take that person back, and usually didn't get any fee for that. So they were very careful to make sure nobody got on a boat unless they thought there was some possibility they would actually be allowed to go into Australia. Even despite that, they of course did end up having to take many people back, and were often fined £100 into the bargain. So it was a very effective one for controlling things. Biggie in those days, of course, ships were the only way. So the ships were it. If people wanted to get around the dictation test, they did so mainly through smuggling and through substitutions by having false documents and so forth, which again, the shipping companies weren't held responsible for that. Well, they were for some smuggling or desertions, which was another way, which is where someone was a member of the ship's crew, and then they deserted the ship in the terminology of the time. They jumped off the ship and stayed in Australia. The shipping company was responsible for that. So again, they were careful to try and manage that as much as they could. But by and large, despite these ways of evading it, I think the detention just was very successful from the white Australia's point of view, and certainly reduced the numbers very greatly. As we'll see in the next lecture, how the community shrank quite a lot in the 1920s into the early 30s before it began to grow again for various things changed in the international scene.
So languages play a big role.
Yes, oh yes, very much.
Interesting. I think that's all we have. I mean, the last two are not really questions, so they're answering to other people's questions. So thank you so much, Michael, for another very interesting session, and thanks all the audience for your very active contribution and participation. So we really look forward to the next one. And thank you all. And this session has been recorded and will be again posted on our website along with the previous 3 now. So yeah, you're more than welcome to get on the website to watch it again or refer it forward to other people. Thank you very much, and have a good night. Thanks, Michael. Thanks,
thank you.
everyone.
See you later. Bye-bye.